Thank you so much for having me. Hello, friends. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this Counter Summit for Democracy. It's really great to be alongside so many comrades from around the world speaking out against US imperialism. I grew up in the US and I've lived in Quebec for the past 8 months, and just want to say that living here has made it very clear to me that even though Canada gets glorified by US liberals, the Canadian working class is suffering from the same crises of capitalism, and Canada is simply a lapdog of US imperialism. And of course, being a lapdog of US imperialism was the only criteria to be invited to Biden's so-called Summit for Democracy, not to be a real democracy. Instead of uplifting true people's democracies, which have dynamic mass participation, such as those in Cuba and China, Biden's summit promoted the overthrow of these governments. As Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez said, the US Democracy Summit was selective and virtual as its own democracy, a reflection of its own international moral isolation. He's right, the US is increasingly isolating itself, and it's clear each day that its hegemony is in decline. On the other hand, countries like China and Cuba are overcoming the US efforts to diplomatically isolate them by practicing true internationalism and paving the way to peace and multipolarity. The US is doing everything it can to stop these inevitable changes rather than address the needs of its own population. Biden's Summit for Democracy would have better been called a summit against a democratic world. Biden used his summit to prop up US regime change operations under the guise of democracy promotion. Like Carlos Ron mentioned, regime change is a lot more subtle now. Foundations like the National Endowment for Democracy, a CIA front group, are some of the most blatant examples of how the US uses democracy as a weapon to undermine real democracy in the name of democracy. Over the past 20 years, the NED and US aid have allocated over $250 million to programs targeting Cuba. These programs aim to mutate real economic dissatisfaction in Cuba into violent counter-revolutionary protests. These protests have been utter failures because people in Cuba are dissatisfied by the US blockade, not by the Cuban government. But the US is still trying to fulfill its original goal of the blockade, which is, in the words of the State Department itself, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. Over 60 years of the longest and most severe unilateral sanctions in the world have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, the decrease of tourism to Cuba, but more significantly by Trump's hawkish policy towards Cuba, which saw the reversal of Obama-era normalization, the addition of 243 new sanctions on Cuba, and the re-addition of Cuba to the so-called state sponsors of terrorism list. In spite of Biden's campaign promises to revert to Obama-era policy, he has kept nearly every single one of Trump's added sanctions, and he's doubled down on the fallacy that Cuba is a terrorist state. Biden could change this designation with the stroke of his pen. In reality, the blockade is not about restoring democracy in Cuba, despite the US attempts to portray it as such. No, these sanctions are designed to force Cuba into a return to capitalist dictatorship. US laws condition the lifting of sanctions on the complete destruction of Cuba's revolutionary political and economic systems. For example, the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, commonly known as the Torricelli Act, requires that for sanctions to be lifted, Cuba must change its constitution, return US property that was legally nationalized by Cuba, move toward establishing a free market economic system, and hold elections for a new government. This act promotes US intervention by authorizing the president to provide assistance to promote nonviolent democratic change in Cuba. So the so-called Cuban Democracy Act is really about tearing apart Cuba's existing democracy and replacing it with what the US deems to be fair elections. The blockade is not about forcing Cuba to give its people a greater say in their democracy, because Cubans already have one of the most robust democracies in the world. Rather, the blockade is about exerting maximum economic pressure on Cuba to enable the US to impose their so-called model of democracy on Cuba, meaning democracy for the US ruling class to seize and exploit Cuba's people and resources. Reports published by the US government on their plans to remodel Cuba into a capitalist state have even modeled Cuba's transition after the neoliberalization of Eastern Europe during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where economic shock therapy caused a huge drop in life expectancy and rise in disease and poverty. The US wants to reverse the accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution and force Cubans back into the poverty that they lived in under the yoke of the US. These policies are in blatant defiance of international law. They are a gross violation of Cuba's right to sovereignty and self-determination. And not only is the blockade a violation of Cuba's democratic rights, but it is also maintained against the democratic will of the US people and the 96% of countries on Earth which vote year after year to condemn the blockade in the United Nations. A consistent majority of US citizens support normalizing relations with Cuba and lifting sanctions, especially for food and medicine, but we don't get any say in the continuation of the blockade. A recent poll also showed a powerful 0% of US citizens think that Cuba poses a threat to the US, yet the Biden administration continues to label Cuba as terrorist. My organization, the National Network on Cuba, is leading an effort to get Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. There is current push by extreme right-wing Miami Republicans to codify into law Cuba's terrorist designation so that it could only be reversed if Cuba agrees to again destroy its current system and replace it with what the US deems to be democracy. In reality, Cuban democracy is centuries ahead of the so-called democracy that we have in the US. For me, observing Cuba's municipal elections last November was the first time I saw real democracy, even though I worked on dozens of elections in the US. Cuban elections are completely nonpartisan. There is no campaign spending, advertising, or lobbying allowed, and Cuba has consistently much higher voter turnout than most countries around the world. Once elected, Cuban representatives are not paid. They continue their lives as workers alongside the rest of the population, and they can be recalled at any point by voters. The workers are the state in Cuba. In the US, on the other hand, the corporations are the state. Bribery by corporations and lobbyists is legal and a guaranteed path to victory in the US because the candidate who spends the most money almost always wins. In the US, we're only called upon to have a say in our government when elections take place, but in Cuba, elections are not the full extent of how citizens can participate. They are only the beginning. The Constitution is regularly revised with the participation of millions of citizens, and ideas are constantly being generated from the masses, and laws are tested and revised with the masses. This is what real democracy looks like. The father of Cuban independence, Jose Marti, said that in times of crisis, the peoples of the world must rush to get to know each other. This has been exactly Cuba's approach in fighting US attempts at isolation. The US uses its huge leverage over the international financial system to bully other countries into submission, to punish Cuba, and to punish even its own US allies for trading with Cuba. Cuba's approach to building strong diplomatic relationships with other countries is not based on bullying, but on cooperation. Cuba sends doctors, not bombs. And friendships with other countries and the strength of the Cuban people are exactly how the Cuban Revolution has continued to survive. When the blockade first began, the Cuban Revolution was able to survive because of the internationalist solidarity it received from the socialist bloc. And since then, Cuba has returned the favor to working people across the world, including the working people in the US. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Cuba was also able to survive because of the internationalist medical brigades it launched and because of its partnership with the Bolivarian Revolution, and of course, through collaboration with the People's Republic of China on economic development. As we speak, Cuba, along with 148 other countries, is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, collaborating on significant infrastructure and energy projects. While the US blocked vital medical supplies from reaching Cuba during COVID, China supplied them with these supplies and returned the favor to Cuba because Cuba offered material aid to China at the onset of the pandemic. In November 2022, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel visited Algeria, Turkey, Russia, and China. And during this visit, they signed a historic cooperation agreement formalizing a $100 million donation from China to Cuba to help Cuba overcome the economic crisis resulting from the US blockade. This is the difference between the US and China's approaches to diplomacy and to development. China's approach is what gives us hope for a world order that is not based on US unipolar hegemony. Multipolarity, de-dollarization, building unity and cooperation, these will all help Cuba and all countries being strangled by the US to maintain their sovereignty and to hold back regime change. Young people in the US, like me, are increasingly skeptical of US regime change propaganda. More young people see China as a friend, not as an enemy, than any other generation. We see the utter incompetence of the US in their attempts to ban TikTok. We see Biden continuing the destruction of our environment while China is leading the world in reducing carbon emissions. We see that Cuba has the most progressive laws in the world on LGBTQ rights, while fascists in the US are attempting a genocide of transgender people. The Cuban Revolution has survived for over 60 years despite all odds, and we can only imagine the incredible things Cuba will do when it is able to develop free from the constraints of the blockade. I believe that if we fight for it, if we continue to build this international, intergenerational movement, then we will see an end to the blockade in our lifetimes. and we will be able to live in a truly democratic, multipolar world. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak.